izlaganju Distopija od totalitarizma do pop-kulture prikazuje dakle razvoj žanra od 19. stoljeća do današnjih klimatskih i tehnoloških tema. Pozdravimo doktora Čigányika. Izvolite.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here for me, especially as I have a difficulty in understanding Croatian texts and also pronouncing even my favorite Croatian writers' names like that of Miroslav Krleža. And also it's a huge challenge to talk at such a late hour when most of you probably want to have your well-earned dinner. So the best I can do is that I talk about something interesting. And I hope that will happen. So what my topic will be how the marginal genre of dystopia from the end of the 19th century became such an important element of both canonical literature and popular culture by the 21st century. And during this time, the focus of dystopia changed a lot. Originally, mostly was focused around totalitarianism, and later a number of social problems became prominent, especially issues concerning consumer society and then later climate emergency. But the feminist influence is also quite prominent. And I'd also like to talk about a meta-political turn in the end of the 20th century when the rule of corporations became much more important. So this is a very complex literary and today also a filmic genre or filmic tradition that contemporary writers have to engage with. Earlier in this conference, we heard about a number of important writers. Marijana Bijelić spoke about the Strugatsky brothers, and today Tomislav about Milan Šuflaj. But I will mostly talk about essentially writers in English, not because they are any better than the other nations, but they have a greater global influence. And let me begin a little bit with the history or prehistory of the genre, which is pretty uncertain, especially as dystopia very much depends upon the interpretation of the reader, and readers' attitudes changed by time. Today, it's absolutely usual that a reader looks at Thomas More's Utopia with its rigid structures as essentially a dystopia. But the same could happen to Plato's Republic, and as we just heard from Magdalena, Dante's Inferno, or even Boccaccio's Decameron may be interpreted in dystopian terms. The book I'd like to draw your attention to is Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels from 1726, especially the fourth book, the book of the Houyhnhnms, or intelligent horses. Ultimately rational creatures, in their world, passions are completely suppressed. And this whole world is presented in absolutely positive terms by Gulliver, the narrator. This is the only place where he would like to stay. Nevertheless, we have a number of reasons to believe that the irony is at work here. And essentially, what we can see is the paradox of the Enlightenment, that the rule of reason at its extreme creates an inhuman world. And this will remain a very important feature of dystopia up until today. Actually, there's been 300 years of debate now whether the Houyhnhnms are a utopian or a dystopian world. But when you want to find less debatable works less debatably dystopian works, then we better go to the end of the 19th century. And usually H.G. Wells is mentioned in this context, even though he very often described utopian societies that later generations interpret in dystopian terms. However, his 1899 book, When the Sleeper Wakes, with its oppressive society, is usually considered as the first proper dystopia. But as I told you, this is a problematic question. Let's talk about less problematic works in the 20th century, and in my opinion, the genre begins with Jevgenija Zamjatina and George Orwell. I'm very lucky that today both Krešimir and Matthias spoke about Huxley, not only Aldous Huxley, but also the Huxley brothers, so I needn't talk about them. But this is the beginning of totalitarian dystopia. So in these works, the individual in a collectivist world virtually has no influence on the political sphere. Nevertheless, politics permeates even the most intimate and personal aspects of life, like sexuality. So generally, we can say that dystopias from the beginning on implicitly support such political structures where the autonomy of the individual is preserved, essentially pluralistic democracies. And when we talk about the genre of dystopia, we have to speak about Orwell's 1984 specifically, because as scholars agree, this is a so-called ur-text or ancient text of dystopian genre. So it's a very basic text that influences our interpretation of other texts, even ones written much later, and central in the development of the genre. 1984 describes essentially, in my opinion, human freedom presented through its absence. The inhabitants of Oceania are deprived of virtually all of their liberties. They cannot dream of talking freely in the evening about books they like to read, and they also have no chance of reading books carelessly. And we learn everything through the paranoid mind of Winston, but paranoia in this world is not a pathological feature. It's an absolutely natural response to the all-pervasive surveillance. So people live under total control, and what's very important, that also their pasts are under control. Through controlling all the manifestations of the past, or memories, letters, pictures, books, whatever, it becomes absolutely liquid. And this undermines the stability of the individual. The contours of the individual's existence become fluid. Another important feature of this book is the control of language. So it becomes impossible to communicate or even to think about ideas which are incongruous with party ideology. Now, what's very important about this book is not only the literary achievement, but how it became part of political discourse. Because this is what happened. This is essentially a fictive society. These are fictive features. And these fictive phrases and characters created by Orwell, including the adjective created from his pen name, became staples of political discussions about real life political features. So Big Brother and doublespeak are not only mentioned in context of literature, but also in context of our everyday lives. So what we can say that political reality motivates dystopian literature. At the same time, dystopian literature informs political discourse. What is a particularly important misconception about Orwell's 1984 and the dystopian genre in general is that this is a forecast. Let me give you a quotation of the New Year's Eve address by the Prime Minister of Britain in 1983, 30th of December. Quote, "I am convinced that for Britain at least, George Orwell was wrong. 1984 will be a year of hope and a year of liberty." End of hope. Do you know who was the Prime Minister in Britain at that time? Yes, these are the words of Margaret Thatcher. But she was not the only person to be wrong about this, because Orwell could not be either right or wrong about the year 1984. He never made any statement about this. The title of the book is a game. He wrote it in 1948, and then he reversed the last two digits. But what is more important is that generally dystopias are not statements about the future. Nobody can see the future. They are more statements about the present. They look at the tendencies in the present and extrapolate it, give you possible scenarios, what could happen if the tendencies in the present continue unchanged. In the Cold War, at least in the beginning of the Cold War, essentially the Orwellian tendencies continued. So the Orwellian legacy remained in dystopian literature, though a strong feminist influence colored it very much. The primary enemy of the individual's autonomy was still the political power of the state. An important writer here, to my mind, is Anthonyja Burgessa, whose most famous book is A Clockwork Orange, but he wrote a number of other dystopian works like The Wanting Seed and 1985. And even though differently in different books, but he essentially presents an Orwellian totalitarian state. However, he extends it to the critique of postmodern consumer societies, especially as the infantilized mass culture is considered, or the degeneration of education. So what is happening here is that the political focus is slowly moving away to, it doesn't disappear, but the social and technological problems are appearing in the focus, and we might call it the second phase of dystopian literature. And Margaret Atwood was mentioned a number of times today, and I would like to draw your attention to her career, because it demonstrates and to some extent initiates the changes in the dystopian genre. Because her most famous book, The Handmaid's Tale, written in 1985, was essentially an Orwellian work with a very strong feminine perspective, and that changes a lot of things. You might have come across the sequel called The Testaments, which was written 44 years later, the first book. I don't know if there's anything in the history of literature that a sequel is written a generation later, basically, but it didn't change radically things. The TV series, which started to be filmed in 2017, and it's going on up until today, the sixth series is being filmed, became immensely popular, and it was also focusing on, beyond the original themes, a number of contemporary issues. The plot goes very much on, much further than the plot of the original novel. But I'd like to also mention Atwood's Mad Adam trilogy, written in the 21st century, which focuses on the climate emergency, and here political power is missing, and it's corpocratic power, it's power of the corporations which is the danger, plus it overlaps with the post-apocalyptic, which is again an important feature of the 21st century dystopia. So how does dystopia work in the new millennium? The most important aspect is the increasing popularity, that both on page and on the screen, including films and video games, dystopias are everywhere. And also the topics are somewhat changing. The climate emergency is a central issue. Technological anxieties are very, very important, and the post-apocalypse, just as we could see in the example of Atwood's works, becomes part of the genre. And I'd like to say a few words about corpocratic dystopia, so that megacorporations become more powerful than the states, because this is becoming a dominant pattern in dystopian literature. David Mitchell's Cloud Atlas is one good example. If you know this book, it has a complex structure with 6 narratives given in a pretty funny way. In the one called An Horizonous Sonmi 451, is a corporation, is a story where the corporation is indistinguishable from the government, and it describes an ultimate consumer society. Another important work is Dave Egger's The Circle, where an information technology giant is in the center, and it also strongly satirizes the cult of the tech gurus with the superhuman CEO. And what is pretty new is that the new form of voluntary surveillance, especially through social media, when people object themselves to 24 hours of surveillance, and employees really merge in the collectivity of their company. And the company is treated as a force of nature, not as something to be regulated by politics, but politics in fact are in the power of the company. So when we talk about the popularity of dystopia, we should mention two genres. One is young adult fiction. This is where dystopia became prevalent in the past decades. The most important name here is Susan Collins, and really it was the Hunger Games that cemented dystopia in popular culture, both through the books and through the films. But especially in the films, the action scenes are very, very prominent. And even though social criticism does exist, even in the film version, but a typical problem of popular culture is that totalitarian power is equated with a ruthless personality. And this overshadows the institutional and structural problems. And also there is some naivety in the idea that by overthrowing a despotic president, you would solve the structural problems of the society. Another area where dystopia proliferates today is fantasy fiction. One example I'd like to give is Neil Shusterman's Ark of Scythe trilogy, where all the problems of humanity have been solved, even mortality. We are immortals in this trilogy, and a compassionate AI is governing everything, pretty much like divine providence. Nevertheless, as typical in fantasy dystopias, the individual has absolutely no control over their own lives. What Tom Moylan writes about the new dystopias is that very often, so his idea is that a dystopia generally includes implicitly a utopia, because when you know what you don't want, you at least implicitly know what you want. And sometimes it's missing in the new dystopias. They're very often pretty fatalistic, without hope. He uses the term dystopia porn, where dystopia lacks the critical insight, and it becomes, for instance, the background of some action movie. So to sum or to as a conclusion, I'd like to state that the dystopia pretty much defines the intellectual climate of the present. It very well expresses the zeitgeist of the 21st century. And while dystopia is historically the shadow or alter ego of utopia, in the present, utopia exists only in the shadows of dystopia, even though the boundaries of these genres are never completely clear. And it's not unusual to hear the term positive dystopia rather than negative utopia, which expresses that today, unfortunately, we very often see the future as something frightening rather than inspiring hope. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you
so much on your lecture. And now these questions, but in English.
In English, of course.
Yes, of course.
Well, thank you very much for this. I very much like what you have said. Your conclusion that writers of dystopia actually are reflecting today's world, not tomorrow's world.
Yeah.
I think this is totally true. But the question, I'm going to go now with the question, not with the comment. So the question would be, how do you see the future of dystopia in literature? Since you said that, I mean, now dystopia is kind of becoming self-governing. It like a Hollywood movies that, you know, they're made only for money.
Dystopia is everywhere. So dystopia used to be an elite genre, and certainly it no longer is, or it's not only an elite genre. So now we have a lot more dystopias than any time in the history of literature. So it's pretty natural that there have to be some low-quality dystopias, but that doesn't mean that the high-quality dystopia with a new insight. So really what I think is problematic is the repetitiveness of the genre. When you have the same structures, the same ideas coming up all the time. Now that I think is, if that continues, that's pretty much the death of the genre, but it doesn't mean that insight, that real social criticism must disappear from dystopia. I can still read pretty good dystopias, so now you have to make a stricter selection.
I agree with this, but you said also dystopia porn, and I think this is really the future of dystopia, at least in 99%, I mean, because it's going to make money. So you cannot avoid it.
So dystopia porn really means this is something which is expected by the readers and the audience of movies. So you're gonna get something like this without any depth, without any. This is there. This is something which appears in movies and also in literature. So in a way, yes, this is one of the futures of dystopia. But I don't believe that this means that good dystopia, profound dystopia disappears.
So in a way, dystopia literature is actually becoming real. Like, I mean, you know, now we have a real dystopia in the literature because of this dystopia porn.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Zsolt, thank you.
Mislim samo da se kolegica javila prije vas, pa ćemo onda vama lijepo završiti.
Thank you for your brilliant talk. I have a brief question. Do you think that Stanislav Lem's Futurology Congress is a good example of dystopia?
Lem's works are very, very complex, and Lem's thinking is absolutely interesting. I think he pretty often cuts across genres, and generally I look at genres as strategies for readers and options, and really the best books very often cannot be very well characterized because they don't fit into the category. So I'm afraid I won't be able. I see that there are dystopian aspects in it, and I can't give a clear answer to your question. I see the dystopian and also the utopian aspects in Lem's works, including this one. Earlier we had a discussion with Magdalena about what you can call dystopia, and there is a strict definition of the genre. Just like for utopia, you need to have a social structure. Now, okay, so if you have if you take this strict definition, that probably Lem is out, and then Dante's Inferno is out, and Boccaccio is out. But do we really need to stick to this strict definition? Because especially for the youth today, they will approach utopia from the popular cultural attitude, from what popular culture offers them, and that will be not so rigid. That will be more like an attitude, very much an aesthetics. In the movies, you immediately can see a dystopian city. So there's an aesthetic aspect to it. So why limit the meaning of dystopia to the traditional structures?
So first of all, thank you for your beautiful exposure.
Thank you.
Regarding our afternoon conversation about Peter Esterházy novel and his destiny and his disillusion about when he found out that his father was actually a spy of the Secret Service of Hungary, he added one new book when he wrote it Celestis, Harmonia
Celestis, yeah.
Celestis, when he found out that his father was actually, he glorified him in the first book when he wrote the history of his family during the Habsburg time. And this second expanded edition, which he wrote, which I read by, without birth. It was such a strong disillusion. Would you call this family dystopia?
Family dystopia, it sounds great. And if we accept this broader definition of dystopia, then why not? But what I feel more strongly is that there is a dystopian reality behind this. So there's a father. This is Péter Eszterházy, the Hungarian writer who passed away a few years ago, and he comes from an aristocratic background, and his father, the communist secret service.
He wrote him in the first, the Harmonia itself, he wrote about him.
I spoke to people who met, Mátyás was his name, and he was a very lovely person, the ideal secret agent, I would say. Nobody believed he was a secret agent, and he was an aristocrat. So this is what the Communist Party needed, the information from the aristocratic circles. His family didn't know anything about this, but his son saw the reports. He opened the file, looked at his father's handwriting. From the first moment, he recognized that could be no mistake. This is his father's, and it's a thick file. So it's horrible. But what my point is that there was a dystopian reality. There's this father who would like to raise his 4 children, and he cannot. He's working hard, he's a literary translator, he's an editor, and it doesn't matter because the Communist Party tells him that unless you work with us, then you don't have a future.
He had a son who played great football.
Yeah. So it's for me, it's more the dystopian reality of Hungary in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and this then boils down to, as you said, a family dystopia.
Thank you.